Some stone fortresses stood unconquered for over 500 years. This video reveals the hidden blueprint behind their incredible longevity, showing you exactly how medieval strongholds evolved into nearly perfect defensive systems. We will uncover why certain castles became legends while others crumbled, exploring the brilliant architectural tricks and psychological strategies that outsmarted entire armies. How did a simple shift from square to round towers render some walls almost invincible? What was the secret to surviving a siege that dragged on for more than a decade? By the end, you will understand the fascinating tactical evolution that allowed these stone sentinels to defy time itself. What do you believe is the ultimate secret to lasting power? That first crucial step was a mound of earth and a wooden tower, a design known as the Motte and Bailey. From a distance, it was an imposing sight on the flat landscape, a clear symbol of a lord's authority. The Motte was a steep, man-made hill, often surrounded by a deep ditch. At its summit stood a wooden keep, a watchtower and final stronghold. Spread out at the base was the Bailey, a large enclosed courtyard protected by a wooden palisade fence and another ditch. This entire complex was a self-contained community for a garrison, offering a high vantage point to spot approaching enemies and a formidable barrier against raids. But for all its strategic advantages, its weaknesses were profound. Wood burns, earth erodes. A determined enemy with fire arrows or simple axes could breach these defenses in a matter of days. This fundamental vulnerability forced a radical rethinking of power and protection. The very limitations of these early forts sparked an architectural arms race, pushing medieval engineers to seek a more permanent, more resilient solution. They began to build in stone. Stone became the new language of power. This was not a simple upgrade from wood to a tougher material. It was a complete transformation of warfare's landscape. A stone castle could resist the very things that made wooden forts so vulnerable. Fire arrows fizzled out against its walls. Battering rams thudded against an unyielding surface. Scaling ladders became far less effective when the wall they leaned against was twice as high and smooth as polished rock. This single change in substance fundamentally shifted the balance of power, forcing attackers to completely rethink their entire approach. To supply this building boom, quarries were carved into hillsides across the continent. The sound of chisels became the sound of territorial ambition. The skilled stonemason, with his knowledge of geometry and load-bearing structures, rose in status, his craft now as crucial to a lord's security as the sword of a mounted knight. But the impact of stone went far beyond the physical. A fortress of stone was a statement carved into the earth itself. It projected an image of unassailable authority and dynastic permanence, a declaration that its ruler was not just passing through but was there to stay for centuries. The very sight of these colossal structures rising on the horizon signaled a new era, one where defense was no longer a temporary measure but a permanent, formidable fact of life. Yet this new strength of stone presented a new kind of problem. A castle built on a flat plain, no matter how thick its walls, was still fundamentally vulnerable. Its defenders were blind to anything happening beyond the immediate horizon. The solution was not just in the material, but in the very ground it stood upon. The single most important factor in a fortress's location was elevation. A high position on a hill, a cliff, or a rocky promontory provided a massive and undeniable tactical advantage. Think of the difference between looking up at a threat and looking down upon it. From a commanding height, defenders could spot the dust cloud of an approaching army from miles away. They could count the enemy's numbers, observe their formations, and track their movements long before they ever reached the outer gates. This simple fact of altitude completely nullified the element of surprise, one of an attacker's most powerful tools. But the advantages did not stop with vision. Gravity itself became a weapon in the hands of the defenders. A rock dropped from a high wall hits with far more crushing force than one thrown on level ground. Boiling oil or water gained terrifying momentum on its downward path. Even arrows fired from a height flew farther, struck harder, and could arc down onto enemies trying to take cover. This principle of the commanding height was so fundamental, so deeply ingrained in military thinking, that it influenced every single design choice that followed. It forced any attacking army to fight an exhausting uphill battle, both physically and psychologically. The high ground was not just a feature, it was the first, most powerful, and most enduring line of defense. But a high position was only the beginning of the story. That advantage would mean nothing without a shield, a barrier to transform a commanding view into an unbreachable fortress. This shield was the curtain wall, a colossal ring of stone that defined the castle's very heart. Picture a sheer, towering face of masonry, so high that the men at its top looked like ants to those below. Its purpose was brutally simple: to stand firm against the most violent assaults imaginable. The sheer height of this wall turned scaling ladders into instruments of suicide, a long and shaky climb into a hail of arrows and rocks. Its staggering thickness, sometimes more than 20 feet of solid stone, was designed to absorb the relentless pounding of siege engines for weeks, even months on end. Builders employed clever tricks to reinforce this main shield, often constructing it with a battered base. This meant the wall sloped outward at the bottom, a subtle but brilliant design. This slope forced battering rams to strike at a glancing, less effective angle, and it also caused stones dropped from the top to ricochet outwards violently into anyone at the base. More importantly, this sloped foundation made the wall far more stable, countering the efforts of sappers trying to tunnel underneath to collapse its defenses. Yet these walls were far from passive. They were not just inert barriers, but active, living defensive systems. The top of the curtain wall, the wall walk, was a bustling thoroughfare for soldiers, while the front face was pierced with strategic openings for archers. This great stone canvas was where the true art of defense was painted, a masterpiece of military engineering waiting to reveal its deeper secrets. But the greatest strength of a wall also created its greatest weakness, the gate. This was the one necessary opening, the single point where an army had to be allowed to pass in times of peace, making it the most tempting target for attack in times of war. Rather than try to hide this vulnerability, medieval engineers embraced it, transforming the gate from a simple doorway into the most fearsome and complex defensive structure in the entire fortress, the gatehouse. This was not an entrance, it was a gauntlet. The approach alone was a test of courage. A deep ditch, often filled with water, lay before the main walls. The only way across was a wooden drawbridge which could be withdrawn in an instant, leaving attackers stranded. Should an enemy manage to cross, they then faced the portcullis. This was a massive iron or oak grating, bristling with spikes along its bottom edge, suspended just inside the gateway. At a moment's notice, guards could release the mechanism, sending this ton of metal crashing down to block the passage, potentially crushing the first ranks of any force trying to push through. And if an attacker somehow survived the drawbridge and shattered the portcullis, their trouble had only just begun. They would then funnel into a narrow, stone-lined passage, dark and confining. Looking up, they would see the most dreaded feature of all, the murder holes. These were openings in the ceiling of the passageway, and from them, defenders could rain down a hellish storm of heavy stones, boiling water or quicklime. There was no room to maneuver, no way to fight back. The gatehouse brilliantly turned an attacker's own momentum against them. The very act of forcing their way inside became a death sentence as they packed themselves into a perfectly designed killing zone. This single structure demonstrated a profound shift in defensive thinking, moving from pure obstruction to active, intelligent entrapment. Even the most formidable gatehouse could be outflanked by a patient enemy, which is why a truly complete defense required one more defining feature. Encircling the entire fortress was the moat, a wide and often terrifying ditch that served as the castle's first and most universal line of deterrence. While we often picture these trenches filled with water, their true function was far more versatile. A water-filled moat was indeed a brilliant defense against one of the most feared siege tactics, mining. Sappers digging a tunnel to undermine the walls would find their passage suddenly flooding, drowning their efforts in an instant. Yet a dry moat was still an incredibly effective barrier. It forced any attacking army to a grinding halt right at the base of the walls. Soldiers would have to scramble down into the ditch and then back up the other side, all while exposed to a constant rain of arrows and stones from the battlements above. This simple trench dramatically increased the effective height of the walls, adding another 20 or 30 feet of deadly, open space that an attacker had to cross. Some commanders made this no-man's land even more lethal, littering the bottom of the dry moat with sharpened stakes, concealed pits, or caltrops designed to maim and slow down anyone who reached it. The moat's genius lay in its power to disrupt and delay. It broke the momentum of a charge, it funneled soldiers into predictable, killable paths, and it gave defenders all the time they needed to aim their next volley. This simple ditch transformed the open ground around a castle into a perfectly designed shooting gallery, proving that the most effective defenses were often the ones that controlled the battlefield long before an enemy ever touched the stone. But the perfection of the wall and its gatehouse exposed another, more subtle flaw in the castle's anatomy. Look to the corners. The earliest stone towers were almost universally square or rectangular, a seemingly logical and easy shape to build. Yet these sharp, 90-degree angles created massive blind spots for the archers stationed on top. A soldier at the center of one wall could not see, let alone fire upon, an enemy who had pressed themselves directly against the base of the adjacent wall. This dead zone was a gift to any attacker, a safe haven where they could work undisturbed, perhaps starting a fire against the wooden gates or, even worse, beginning the painstaking process of mining. The corner of a square tower was also the perfect target for siege engines. A heavy stone projectile striking a flat surface transfers its energy with devastating effect, cracking and shattering the masonry. But when that same stone hits a curved surface, its force is deflected, glancing off harmlessly. The solution was as elegant as it was effective: the round tower. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a complete re-engineering of defensive geometry. A circular tower eliminated the vulnerable corner entirely. There was no safe place for a sapper to dig, as the entire structure presented a continuous, unbroken curve, and every single point on its surface was a sloping, glancing plane for incoming projectiles. The advantages extended to the defenders on the battlements as well. A round tower provided a panoramic, 360-degree field of view and fire. Archers could now cover every inch of the wall base below, leaving no hiding place. This single architectural shift from the square to the circle was a direct and brilliant answer to the evolving threats on the battlefield. It demonstrated that a castle's true strength lay not just in its height or thickness, but in its intelligent, adaptive shape. This architectural evolution reached its zenith with a terrifying innovation that turned the castle's own silhouette into a weapon. The blind spot at the very base of the wall, that sliver of safety for any attacker who managed to press against the stone, was now completely eliminated. The solution was the Machicolation, a stone gallery projecting outward from the top of the battlements. From a distance, it looked like a stone crown resting on the wall, but its true purpose was revealed from below. The floor of this gallery was not solid. It was punctured with deliberate, deadly openings. Through these holes, defenders could observe anyone directly beneath them, and more importantly, drop objects straight down. No longer did they have to lean precariously over the main wall, exposing themselves to enemy fire. They could stand safely within the stone gallery and pour a continuous stream of destruction onto the heads of their enemies. The psychological impact was as powerful as the physical one. The entire perimeter of the castle was now ringed with this lethal umbrella. The sound of rocks and boiling water crashing down from these openings created a constant, terrifying percussion for any soldier below. A direct assault on the walls was no longer a test of courage. It was a calculated death sentence. This single feature forced besieging armies to abandon centuries of conventional tactics. Why risk certain death trying to scale a wall when the very act of approaching it meant walking into a slaughterhouse? The Machicolation was the ultimate expression of defensive foresight, proving that the most brilliant fortresses did not just withstand attacks, they actively punished them. This psychological warfare began the moment an army crested the horizon. A commander would raise his eyes to see not just walls, but a statement carved in stone, a declaration of such overwhelming strength that it could shatter an army's will before a single sword was drawn. The sheer scale was the first and most potent weapon. Imagine being a soldier looking up at a curtain wall that blotted out the sky, knowing you had to find a way over or through it. The towering gatehouse was not just a defensive structure, it was a grimacing face, its dark arrow slits like watchful eyes, and its raised portcullis like a mouth ready to snap shut. Every element was calculated to project an image of invincibility and permanence. A rival lord considering an attack would perform a brutal calculation. He would see the high, round towers, the Machicolations poised to rain death, and the wide, forbidding moat. He would then have to consider the cost, not just in gold, but in time and lives. How many months of his treasury would be drained to feed his army camped outside? How many of his men would die in the futile attempt to cross that killing ground? A well-designed fortress communicated one unshakable fact. The defenders inside were prepared to outlast you. They had the high ground, the thick walls, and the deep wells. You had the mud, the disease of a camp, and the slow, demoralizing grind of a stalemate. This was the castle's ultimate defense, the power to make an enemy look at its walls and simply decide to go home. But this psychological masterstroke relied on a hidden truth, one that took place deep within the castle's heart, far from the intimidating battlements. That intimidating silhouette was ultimately just a shell, a magnificent and terrifying bluff if it lacked the one thing that truly sustained a siege from within. The psychological warfare of high walls meant nothing if the defenders inside were starving and thirsty within a fortnight. A fortress's real endurance was measured not in the height of its stone, but in the depth of its storerooms. This was the hidden, unglamorous backbone of survival, a deliberate and massive investment in logistics. While an attacking army camped outside might be able to forage or receive supplies from home, the defenders were completely cut off. Their entire world was now contained within those walls, and its ability to function determined their fate. The most advanced castles were essentially self-sufficient cities in miniature, designed to outlast an enemy's patience and resources. Deep, cool cellars were packed to the ceiling with barrels of grain, sacks of dried beans and peas, and sides of salted or smoked meat. These were foods chosen for one reason above all others: longevity. They could sit for months, even years, without spoiling, providing the basic calories needed to keep hundreds of soldiers and civilians alive. Alongside the food was the other absolute essential: water. A castle without its own secure water source was doomed from the start. Engineers went to incredible lengths to tap into underground springs, digging wells so deep they sometimes took a generation to complete. Some fortresses were built directly over natural caves that served as vast, cool cisterns, collecting rainwater from elaborate gutter systems carved into the roofs. But supplies were not just about food and water. An army fights with weapons, and those weapons break and are spent. A dedicated armory was a constant hive of activity, even in peacetime. Fletchers worked tirelessly, crafting thousands of arrows and crossbow bolts. Blacksmiths repaired swords, hammered out dents in armor, and forged new spearheads. Stockpiles of lumber, nails, and leather were kept ready to repair siege engines or patch damaged sections of the wallwalk. This relentless focus on provisioning turned a siege from a dramatic assault into a grueling war of attrition. The attacking commander was forced to ask himself a brutal question. Did he have enough men, enough money, and enough supplies to wait out a garrison that was prepared to hold out for a year or more? The castle's true power was this ability to turn time itself into a weapon, forcing the aggressor to slowly bleed himself dry on the outside while life, however grim, carried on behind the unyielding stone. A fortress could be stocked with 5 years of grain and still fall in 5 weeks without the one resource no army could substitute. The mastery of water security separated the legendary strongholds from the ones that became historical footnotes. While the moat was a brilliant defensive trench, the internal well was the existential heart of the entire defense. Imagine the monumental effort required to dig a well within the castle's inner ward, a shaft often carved straight down through solid bedrock. Teams of laborers would work for years, chiseling their way deeper and deeper, not for luxury, but for the absolute certainty of a drink of water long after the gates had been sealed shut. This deep, protected source was completely immune to an attacker's most insidious tactics. An enemy could not divert its flow, nor could they poison it from the outside. The well ensured that while the besieging army outside might be suffering from thirst and drinking from muddy, contaminated streams, the defenders inside still had access to clean, cold water drawn from the earth itself. Some coastal fortresses took this principle even further, built on dramatic promontories with secret, winding staircases carved into the cliff face. These hidden paths led down to secluded coves, allowing for emergency supplies to be rowed in under cover of darkness, or for crucial messengers to escape a tightening noose. This relentless focus on securing the fundamental resource of water reveals a profound truth about siege survival. The most intimidating walls and cleverest murder holes were ultimately just a shell. Without the lifeblood of a guaranteed water supply, every other defense would turn to dust, and the grandest fortress would become nothing more than a magnificent stone tomb. Yet a garrison that only waited behind its walls was already losing the psychological war. The ultimate key to survival was not just endurance but controlled aggression. This philosophy was given physical form in the Sally Port, a small, almost invisible door cleverly integrated into the fortress's outer curtain. To an enemy scout, it might look like nothing more than a minor structural seam or be completely hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes. Its purpose was the exact opposite of the main gate. The gatehouse was a spectacle of intimidation, but the Sally Port was a secret, an instrument of surprise. Under the veil of a moonless night or during a heavy rainstorm that masked sound, this hidden door would swing open silently. A hand-picked force of the castle's most skilled and daring soldiers would slip out, moving like shadows across the no-man's land. Their targets were precise and devastating. A small team could reach the enemy's prized trebuchet, douse its massive wooden frame in oil, and set it ablaze before the sleeping guards even knew what was happening. Months of painstaking construction by the attackers could be reduced to ashes in a single, fiery raid. Other times, these raiding parties would target the siege camp itself, creeping past sentries to set fire to supply tents, scatter horses, and sow chaos among a restless army. The goal was not to win the war in one grand battle, but to inflict a death by 1,000 cuts. For the soldiers inside the castle, a successful sally was a massive boost to morale, breaking the soul-crushing monotony of a siege. For the army outside, it was a terrifying reminder. It meant that even in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, they were not the hunters but the hunted. The safety of their own camp was an illusion. The walls were not just a barrier they had to breach, they were a veil hiding a predator that could strike at any moment from any direction. This simple hidden door transformed the entire dynamic of the conflict, proving that a fortress' greatest strength was its ability to seize the initiative without ever abandoning its defenses. The sally port allowed defenders to strike from the shadows, but what happened when the threat came from beneath their feet? Attackers often turned to the ancient and terrifying art of mining, digging tunnels to reach the very foundations of the castle walls. Their goal was simple and devastating: to hollow out a chamber beneath a critical tower or section of the curtain wall, support it with wooden props, and then set the whole thing ablaze. As the timbers burned away, the massive weight of the stone above would come crashing down, creating a breach and potentially dooming the entire garrison. This invisible approach bypassed every defense on the surface, from the high walls to the murder holes. It was a silent, patient, and existential threat. The counter to this subterranean assault was just as ingenious and just as harrowing, a practice known as countermining. The moment defenders felt the faint, telltale vibrations of picks striking earth through the soles of their boots, or heard the muffled sounds of digging through listening devices placed against the ground, the race began. Teams of defenders, often the most resilient miners from the local area, would begin digging their own tunnel from inside the fortress. This was not a random act of desperation, it was a calculated interception. The goal was to dig a tunnel that would precisely intersect the enemy's own excavation. The working conditions were beyond grim. Men labored in pitch-black, cramped tunnels, the air thick with dust and the constant fear of a catastrophic collapse. They worked by the faint light of oil lamps, their world reduced to the scrape of shovels and the creak of wooden support beams. When the two tunnels finally connected, the nature of warfare transformed completely. This was not the ordered chaos of an open battlefield. It was a brutal, intimate struggle for survival in a space no wider than a man's shoulders. In the suffocating darkness, soldiers fought with short swords, knives, and picks, a frantic and horrific brawl where every gasp for air could be your last. The outcome of the entire siege could hinge on this single, claustrophobic confrontation taking place deep underground. But direct combat was not the only option. Sometimes the defenders' goal was not to fight, but to entomb. They would deliberately dig a tunnel just beneath the attacker's sapping gallery, and then collapse their own excavation, bringing a mountain of earth and rock down to crush or bury the enemy miners alive. In other instances, they would use bellows to pump thick, acrid smoke into the connecting tunnel, suffocating the sappers where they stood. This hidden war beneath the soil was a desperate, dirty, and critical battlefront. It proved that a fortress's defense was not confined to its visible ramparts, but extended deep into the earth itself. A three-dimensional battlefield where victory was measured in inches and survival was a matter of sound, vibration, and sheer nerve in the dark. Yet even the deepest countermine could not stop the tremor that would reshape the very concept of fortification. The age of the high stone wall was brought to a violent end not by a better battering ram, but by a flash and a roar. The invention of gunpowder and the cannon introduced a force that traditional medieval architecture was utterly unprepared to withstand. A trebuchet stone battered a wall with brute force, but a solid iron cannonball fired at point-blank range transferred a terrifyingly concentrated impact. It did not just shake the masonry, it pulverized it. Those magnificent high curtain walls, once symbols of invincibility, suddenly became perfect targets. Their vertical faces absorbed the full energy of a cannonball, cracking and crumbling under the relentless barrage. A fortress designed to hold out for years could now be breached in a matter of days. This new reality forced a complete and fundamental rethinking of defensive design. The response was not to build higher, but to build smarter and far more resilient. The new fortress walls became lower and dramatically thicker, often consisting of massive earthen ramparts faced with brick or stone. This was a deliberate shift from deflection to absorption. An earthen bank could swallow a cannonball, its loose soil dissipating the impact energy that would shatter solid rock. Even more brilliantly, these new walls were built with pronounced slopes. An angled or curved surface, much like the rounded towers of the previous era, encouraged incoming shot to glance off harmlessly rather than strike a direct, devastating blow. But the most revolutionary change was in the fortress's overall shape. The familiar rounded keep and square courtyards vanished, replaced by a stark, geometric new form, the Star Fort. These bastion forts, also known as the Trace Italian, featured a series of pointed, angular projections jutting out from the main walls. Each of these bastions was a self-contained artillery platform, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. This design eliminated the deadly blind spots that had plagued older castles. Now, any enemy force attempting to assault one section of the wall would find itself caught in a brutal crossfire from the cannons on the adjacent bastions. The ground in front of the fortress was transformed into a perfectly designed kill zone. This was the final, logical evolution of the defensive principle that began with the round tower, adapted for an age of explosive power. The fortress had learned not just to withstand a siege, but to answer its opening volley with a storm of its own. Geography itself could be the most formidable wall of all. Beyond the Machicolations and the Star Forts, some strongholds achieved near invincibility not through engineering, but through their impossible placement. Consider a castle perched on the jagged spine of a mountain, its foundations fused with the living rock, accessible only by a single, narrow path carved into a vertiginous cliff face. An army arriving at the base of such a peak would look up in despair. How do you transport a multi-ton trebuchet up a near-vertical slope? How do you feed thousands of men when the only available ground is a thin strip of land at the mountain's base, constantly exposed to rockslides triggered by the defenders above? The very landscape became an active participant in the defense, a relentless ally that sapped an invader's strength and morale long before a single arrow was loosed. Other fortresses turned the sea into their moat, built on isolated islands or peninsulas lashed by treacherous waves. They were unreachable by conventional land forces. A naval assault was often just as futile, with hidden reefs and unpredictable currents protecting the seaward walls. In swampy marshlands, heavy siege towers would simply sink into the mire, and an army camped on soggy ground would soon be ravaged by disease. These locations leveraged a simple, brutal truth of warfare. that an army is a massive, cumbersome machine requiring flat ground, reliable supplies, and a clear path to its objective. By denying all three, a geographically blessed fortress could hold out indefinitely with only a skeleton crew. A few hundred determined defenders, secure behind their natural ramparts, could defy an army of thousands, not by winning a battle, but by making a battle impossible to fight. This was the ultimate expression of strategic wisdom, the understanding that the most brilliant defense is the one that never has to be tested. Even the most brilliant geometry could be defeated by despair. A fortress was more than its stone. It was a living, breathing community of people whose will to resist was the final, unbreachable wall. The garrison, the men and women who stood watch on the battlements and repaired the walls by torchlight, held the true key to survival. Their morale was a resource as vital as grain stores and clean water, one that could not be stockpiled but had to be carefully cultivated day by day. A well-fed but disheartened garrison might surrender after the first assault, while a loyal, determined group could endure years of deprivation and terror. This human spirit was the invisible fortress within the stone, and its defense was a commander's most crucial battle. Loyalty was not a given, it was earned. A wise castellan knew his soldiers by name, shared their hardships, and demonstrated unwavering competence. When a commander stood shoulder to shoulder with his men during a midnight Sally Port raid, or refused to take a larger portion of food during a shortage, he forged a bond stronger than any iron portcullis. The garrison needed to believe in his judgment absolutely, trusting that his decisions, from rationing supplies to ordering a dangerous countermine, were made for their collective survival. This deep-seated trust transformed a disparate group of soldiers, craftsmen, and cooks into a single, resilient organism. They fought not just for a lord or a patch of land, but for each other, for the community they had built behind those walls. This sense of shared purpose was actively nurtured through stories. On long, quiet evenings, veterans would recount tales of past sieges where their fortress had held firm against impossible odds. They spoke of legendary defenders who had repelled 100 men from a single breach, or of the clever ruse that tricked an enemy army into retreat. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were a strategic weapon. They wove a tapestry of identity and invincibility, teaching every new recruit that they were part of a legacy of resilience. It whispered a powerful truth: we have faced this before, and we have always prevailed. That collective memory became a shield against fear and doubt, reinforcing the belief that their walls had never fallen and never would. When the final assault came and the ramparts shook with the impact of siege engines, it was this intangible will that determined the outcome. Could a soldier find the courage to stand firm as a storm of arrows darkened the sky? Would a miner, deep in the suffocating darkness of a counter-tunnel, press forward against the sound of enemy picks drawing nearer? The answer lay in the spirit of the garrison. A fortress with high morale did not just endure, it fought back with a ferocity that could break an attacker's resolve. The final, decisive factor in any long siege was not the thickness of the walls, but the strength of the heart beating behind them. This human element turned a strong defensive position into a truly unconquerable legend. That unbreakable garrison spirit was a powerful shield, but even the most determined defenders knew they could not hold out forever. The ultimate key to a fortress's survival often lay far beyond its walls, in the strength of its alliances. A wise ruler never viewed his castle as an isolated island of stone, but as the central node in a vast web of political and military loyalty. He cultivated strong bonds with neighboring lords and, most importantly, with his sovereign king or queen. This network of allegiance was a diplomatic shield, a strategic layer of defense that could shatter an enemy's plans without a single arrow being fired from the battlements. A besieging army, for all its strength, was operating on borrowed time. The commander knew that every day spent camped outside the walls was a day that a powerful relief force could be mustering. This looming threat forced him into a terrible dilemma. He could risk a costly direct assault to take the fortress quickly, sacrificing thousands of his men in the process, or he could settle in for a long siege, all while looking nervously over his shoulder, waiting for the dust cloud of the approaching Allied army. The psychological pressure was immense. The knowledge that a friendly army was on the march could electrify a garrison, turning grim endurance into hopeful defiance. It meant their sacrifice had a purpose and an endpoint. For the attackers, it transformed the entire campaign. They were no longer just besieging a static target. They were now vulnerable themselves, trapped between the unyielding fortress walls and the hammer of an approaching field army. A single fortress, through the power of its alliances, could effectively pin down and threaten an entire invading force. Its true strength was not just measured by the thickness of its stone, but by the reach of its friendships and the speed with which its calls for help could be answered. That web of alliances relied on a foundation far more tangible than promises or oaths. Every stone in the curtain wall, every barrel of salted meat, and every arrow in the armory had a price. Building and maintaining a state-of-the-art fortress was an astronomical financial undertaking, a relentless drain on a treasury that never truly ended. The initial construction alone could bankrupt a minor lord, requiring not just the quarrying and transport of thousands of tons of stone, but the skilled labor of stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths for years on end. This was not a one-time expense. Walls cracked in the winter freeze and needed repointing. Roofs leaked and required new timber. The drawbridge's intricate mechanism needed constant maintenance by a specialized craftsman. A fortress was a living entity with a voracious appetite for gold and silver. This perpetual demand for funding created an inseparable link between economics and defense. The security of a lordship was directly proportional to the health of its coffers. A prosperous domain with fertile farmlands yielding reliable harvests or control over a lucrative trade route generated the steady stream of wealth required for perpetual readiness. This income paid for the teams of laborers who cleared silt from the moat each spring. It funded the purchase of high-quality iron from distant regions to forge stronger weapons. It allowed a lord to hire a renowned military engineer from Italy or the Holy Land, a man whose knowledge of the latest defensive geometry was worth a king's ransom. This economic engine also secured the loyalty of the garrison itself. A well-paid soldier who received his wages on time and saw his family housed safely within the bailey was a steadfast defender. A garrison left unpaid and hungry, however, was a powder keg of mutiny waiting for a spark. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Prosperity funded security, and that security in turn protected the very lands, towns, and trade routes that generated the prosperity. A powerful fortress became a safe haven for merchants, encouraging markets to flourish under its shadow, which then filled the lord's treasury with taxes and tolls. This revenue would then be funneled back into the walls, funding the next round of innovations, perhaps adding a new artillery tower or deepening the well. The greatest fortresses were not just military marvels. They were the beating hearts of powerful economic enterprises, proving that the ultimate defense was as much about a full treasury as it was about full armories. Those soaring medieval walls were actually built upon a foundation laid centuries earlier. The principles that made a fortress nearly unconquerable were not born in the Dark Ages, but were brilliant rediscoveries from the ancient world. Medieval lords and their engineers looked upon the crumbling ruins of Roman forts and frontier walls scattered across the landscape, and they saw not just fallen stones, but a masterclass in military architecture. The Romans had perfected the art of the castrum, a standardized military camp that was a fortress in miniature, designed to be constructed in a single day by a legion on the march. These temporary forts showcased a timeless logic, a geometric precision that prioritized clear sight lines, defensible gates, and an unbreakable internal order. The medieval mind recognized this genius and began to adapt it for a new era of permanent conflict. They saw how the Romans used elevation not just for watchfulness, but for total battlefield dominance. They studied the sheer, daunting scale of Roman stonework, the mortar that had held for 500 years, and they understood that permanence itself was a form of psychological warfare. Even the terrifying complexity of the medieval gatehouse, with its portcullises and murder holes, finds a direct ancestor in the layered defenses of a Roman fort's Porta Praetoria. This was not simple imitation, it was a profound fusion. Medieval builders took this ancient, tested knowledge and merged it with the harsh lessons learned from their own constant wars. They combined Roman durability with new innovations like the round tower and the Machicolation, creating a hybrid architectural language that was both timeless and entirely new. This connection to a deeper, classical past provided more than just building techniques. It offered a blueprint for resilience. It gave medieval engineers a 1,000-year head start, allowing them to stand on the shoulders of giants to reach even greater heights of defensive power. Rising from the very center of the complex, the Great Keep was a castle within the castle. This towering stone giant was the final redoubt, the ultimate sanctuary when every other defense had fallen. Its walls were the thickest, its entrance the most treacherous, often accessible only by a single, narrow staircase that could be destroyed in an emergency. Within its formidable shell lay the heart of the fortress's power, the lord's private chambers, the deepest well, and the last reserves of food and weapons. A besieging army that had sacrificed thousands to cross the moat and storm the outer walls would look upon this inner citadel with a special kind of dread, for their work was only half done. The keep was designed for a last stand, a brutal battle of attrition where every spiral staircase became a choke point, every hallway a killing zone, and every room a potential fortress. Attackers would have to fight for every inch of ground, ascending dark, winding stairs where only 1 or 2 men could advance at a time, while defenders above dropped stones through murder holes in the vaulted ceilings. But the keep's true power was as much psychological as it was physical. As long as its banner snapped defiantly in the wind above the battlements, the castle was unconquered. That fluttering piece of cloth was a signal to everyone watching, friend and foe alike, that the will of the defenders remained unbroken. It was a symbol of resilience that could demoralize an entire besieging army, forcing them to wonder if any victory was worth the blood price of storming this final, terrifying stronghold. The keep was the unshakable core of the entire defensive philosophy, proving that a fortress's greatest strength was its refusal to ever fully surrender. That unshakable core of the keep now found its ultimate expression in a revolutionary new layout. The pinnacle of medieval fortress evolution was the concentric castle, a design of devastating genius. Instead of a single protective shell, these fortresses featured multiple layers of completely independent walls, one nestled inside the other like a set of stone nesting dolls. Picture an attacker's momentary triumph as their battering ram finally splinters the outer gate and their soldiers pour through the breach, only for that triumph to curdle into sheer horror. They have not entered the castle, they have entered a trap, Before them rises a second, even higher inner wall, its battlements swarming with archers. They are now stuck in a narrow, ring-shaped killing ground, completely exposed to a storm of arrows and bolts coming from both in front and behind them. Every step forward into this deadly maze only makes their position more vulnerable. There is no cover, no way to retreat under the hail of fire from the outer wall they just conquered, and no way to advance against the unbreached inner defenses. This concentric design was a masterpiece of psychological and tactical planning. It turned an attacker's greatest achievement, breaching the outer defenses, into their final mistake. The garrison, now concentrated on the higher inner wall, could defend a much smaller perimeter with overwhelming force. A direct assault was no longer just difficult, it was virtually suicidal, as every success simply funneled the enemy into a pre-designed slaughterhouse. This was the fortress evolved into its most perfect and forbidding form. Krak des Chevaliers stands as the ultimate expression of everything a fortress could be. Perched high on a Syrian ridge, this colossal stronghold held by the Knights Hospitaller was a masterpiece of military design that defied capture for more than 100 years. It was not merely a castle, but an entire defensive ecosystem carved in stone. Its location was the first layer of its genius, a commanding height that forced any approaching army to stare upward in exhaustion before a single arrow was ever fired. But the true brilliance of Krak lay in its revolutionary concentric walls. An attacker who somehow managed to breach the intimidating outer curtain did not find victory, only a more terrifying reality. They would be funneled into a narrow, deadly corridor between the outer and inner walls, a perfect killing ground where defenders on the higher inner ramparts could rain destruction upon them from all sides. There was no cover, no way forward, and no safe retreat. Every architectural element served a ruthless purpose. The towers were massively rounded, presenting no flat surface for siege engines to target and no blind spots for sappers to exploit. Its storerooms and cisterns were vast enough to sustain a large garrison for years, turning any siege into a waiting game the defenders were almost guaranteed to win. So formidable was its physical design that it never fell to a direct assault. Krak des Chevaliers was ultimately taken through a forged letter, a ruse that tricked the defenders into believing their own Grand Master had ordered them to surrender. This final, deceptive victory for the besiegers was, in fact, the ultimate complement to the fortress's power. It proved that the stone itself was so unconquerable that the only way through was to bypass its defenses entirely by targeting the human spirit within. Krak was the living, breathing proof that when all the principles of defense were perfected and combined, they could create something that was less a building and more a permanent fact of the landscape. The story of Krak des Chevaliers finds a powerful echo on the windswept white cliffs of England. Dover Castle was not born from a single brilliant design, but from a relentless process of adaptation driven by one undeniable fact of geography. It guarded the shortest crossing to continental Europe, making it the key to the kingdom. Any invader, any trade ship, any diplomatic envoy had to pass under its gaze. This was not a fortress meant for occasional war. It was a permanent sentinel on the front line, and its entire history was shaped by this endless duty. Its first great phase of construction came under King Henry II, a monarch determined to project his power. He commissioned the Great Keep, a towering stone giant that was among the most sophisticated in all of Europe. This was not just a final refuge, it was a royal palace and a statement of absolute authority, visible from the sea. Its walls were thick enough to withstand any trebuchet, and its design included all the latest defensive tricks, from a heavily fortified stairway to multiple layers of walls. Yet this magnificent medieval fortress was only the beginning. As warfare changed, so did Dover. When the age of cannon arrived, its medieval battlements were reinforced with earthwork bastions designed to absorb and deflect artillery fire. The castle morphed again during the Napoleonic Wars, when engineers worried about invasion carved deep tunnels into the very chalk of the cliffs, creating barracks for thousands of soldiers hidden safely underground. This evolution reached its peak in the 20th century, when those same tunnels were transformed into a secret command center during the Second World War. From here, Admiral Ramsay directed the miraculous evacuation of Dunkirk, a complex naval operation that saved an entire army. The same fortress that once rained arrows down on medieval invaders was now using telephone lines and radio waves to coordinate a modern fleet. Dover Castle is a living lesson in military endurance. It proves that a fortress's true strength is not frozen in a single moment of architectural perfection, but in its fluid ability to reinvent itself for every new era of conflict, always ensuring that its walls, whether of stone or carved chalk, never lose their meaning. Yet even the concentric walls of Krak and the endless adaptation of Dover could not hold back the tide forever. For all their brilliance, these stone giants were not invincible, and their eventual fall reveals the final, sobering chapter in their story. The most decisive blow came from the relentless advancement of gunpowder artillery. A cannon did not just hit a wall, it delivered a concentrated hammer blow of force that could pulverize masonry crafted to withstand the slower, broader impact of a trebuchet stone. Fortresses designed over centuries to defeat scaling ladders and battering rams were suddenly tragically obsolete. Their high, vertical walls became perfect targets, and a siege that might have once dragged on for years could now be decided in a matter of weeks. But the end did not always come from outside. A fortress's strength was a hollow shell if its ruler fell into economic decline. The astronomical cost of maintaining walls, stocking granaries, and paying a loyal garrison was a constant drain. A bankrupt lord might watch helplessly as his moat silted up and his timber gates rotted, leaving his magnificent stronghold a brittle, vulnerable relic. Political shifts could be just as fatal. A castle built to command a strategic mountain pass might find itself suddenly irrelevant after a war ended or a border moved, its purpose erased by a stroke of a diplomat's pen. And sometimes the most sophisticated defenses were undone by the simplest human weakness, betrayal. A well-placed bribe could convince a guard to leave a sally port unbarred, or a forged order could manipulate a proud castellan into surrendering without a fight, as happened at Krak des Chevaliers. The long history of the fortress, therefore, is not a tale of perfect eternal strength. It is the story of a magnificent, centuries-long rearguard action, a brilliant but ultimately losing battle against the twin forces of technological progress and human fallibility. Their enduring legacy is not that they never fell, but that they stood so defiantly for so long against the inevitable. This seamless integration of every defensive layer is what truly defined an unconquerable fortress. The commanding height of the walls meant nothing if the well within them ran dry. The strongest gatehouse could be betrayed by a single disheartened soldier. Every element, from the deepest cellar to the highest battlement, was a single link in an unbreakable chain. This was not a collection of independent strengths, but a deeply interdependent system where each part supported and amplified the others. The psychological intimidation of the high walls bought time for the garrison, whose high morale in turn made those walls even more formidable. The secure water supply from the deep well empowered the risky sally port raids, which then disrupted the enemy siege lines and protected the walls from sustained assault. The economic prosperity of the lands around the castle funded the constant maintenance and innovation, which in turn secured the trade routes that generated that very prosperity. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of resilience. A failure in any single area, whether a collapsed well, a mutinous garrison, or an empty treasury, could cause the entire intricate system to unravel. This holistic understanding elevated defense from a matter of simple masonry to a complex art form. The architects of these legendary strongholds were not just building with stone, they were weaving a tapestry of power, one that blended geography, engineering, economics, and human spirit into a single living entity. This was the ultimate evolution, the moment a fortress ceased to be a mere structure and became a permanent force of nature. The story of these enduring fortresses is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of conflict. From the first wooden Motte and Bailey to the stone giants of Krak des Chevaliers, we have traced a continuous tactical evolution, a conversation of stone and strategy where every new weapon prompted a smarter wall and every breach inspired a more brilliant gate. These structures were never static, they were living documents in an endless arms race. They teach us that resilience is not about being impenetrable, but about being adaptable, about learning from every failure and anticipating every new challenge. Their true legacy is etched not just in quarried rock, but in the very principles of defense, a logic of layered security, psychological warfare, and logistical depth that echoes through the centuries. These stone sentinels stand as monuments to a powerful truth, that the ultimate defense is a mind constantly thinking several steps ahead of the next attack. If this exploration of unyielding strength has captivated you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the hidden logic of history. We would love to hear which of these magnificent structures or clever defensive tricks you find most fascinating, so please share your own thoughts in the comments below.